Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Carlin. In the psychedelic space, or psychedelic renaissance, it's been coined, we hear a lot about psychedelics for therapeutic use, to heal from PTSD and addiction and depression and all the ailments that our modern Western culture seems to offer us. But who uses psychedelics the most? Actually, the largest use of psychedelics globally and in the United States are people using them recreationally or for personal use. So, when we consider looking at changing drug policy in the United States and moving forward in a way that supports all usage of psychedelics, it's important to consider who's using them, how, the risks in the way they're used, what drugs are being used. It's also important to consider that psychedelics sit in a larger context of drug policy globally. We can't have a conversation about psychedelics' potentials to heal without including experimental use, which also has great benefits of healing. So today I invited Steve Rolls on, and it's a really interesting conversation that illuminated for me some of the ways in which my thinking around drug policy were kind of narrow. Steve is a Senior Policy Analyst for the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. He has over 25 years of drug policy and law reform analysis and advocacy, promoting more just and effective drug policies that center on public health, human rights, and sustainable development. He also has served as an advisor and lead drafter for the Global Commission on Drugs and is acting as a consultant on drug policy and regulation for several European governments and UN agencies. He has also authored numerous reports, academic papers, and a book that we're going to dive into today called How to Regulate Psychedelics, A Practical Guide. Outside of psychedelics, he wrote No Nonsense, Legalizing Drugs, How to End the War, and After the War on Drugs. So in this conversation, we talk about who's doing psychedelics. Should psychedelics be regulated? How do we look at psychedelics within the context of a larger global drug policy movement? Steve highlights areas where decriminalization is working, and not just decriminalization of psychedelics, but some of the drugs that we don't like to talk about. So he opens up my mind on a way to move forward with drug policy that is more health-oriented versus criminalization-oriented. We also dive into what's working in Colorado, what's working in Oregon, and what's not working. In How to Regulate Psychedelics, his practical guide, Steve gives us a 4-tiered model that is very flexible for regulating psychedelics. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Steve Rolls. I'm here today with Steve Rolls. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So I'd love to hear, first of all, how you got here. Why drug policy?
Well, like you say, it was more than 20 years ago. It was in the late 90s, so actually almost 25 years ago. My academic background was in geography, which is not obviously linked to drug policy, but I then did a master's in international relations and development studies with a view to going into development work. And I was working at Oxfam, the development organization that you may have heard of, a huge multinational development organization with thousands of staff in a little regional office. And the work wasn't exciting me. I was just in a regional office doing what was instructed by head office. And while I was there, an organization was set up by a man called Danny Kushlik, who'd been working with drug users in prisons, getting increasingly frustrated about it and wanting to change the law so that less people ended up in prison in the first place. And he felt very strongly that the war on drugs had been a failure and that we needed to be exploring alternatives to the war on drugs and alternatives to prohibition, including the legalization and regulation of drugs, all drugs, effectively all drugs. And he set up an organization to do policy analysis and advocacy around that. And he got some seed funding after a couple of years and advertised for staff. And I saw the advert on the notice board in Oxfam and I applied for it. And that was 25 years ago. I'm still doing it. And it's been quite a journey, because 25 years ago, talking about legalization of any drugs, let alone all drugs, was quite a kind of edgy, fringe, almost sort of extremist position. Like, are you mad? Why would you do that? Drugs are bad for you. Why would you want to legalize them? It was quite full on back then, but over the years, our messaging has become more sophisticated. We've done more work, we've done more advocacy, we've worked with different audiences, we've developed the framing, we've developed our proposals, we've worked with different stakeholders in public health and police and development and environmental movements and all kinds of different groups, parents and teacher groups, different political parties, different countries around the world. And we've developed our proposals as part of a much wider movement. It's not just my organization, Transform, but as part of a wider movement. The drug law reform platform has moved forward. It's made enormous strides over the last 20 years, particularly in the last 5-10 years. We've seen an awful lot of progress with cannabis work. In particular, I mean, obviously, you'll all know about this in the US, but around the world, we're seeing similar cannabis reforms in Canada and Mexico and South Africa and various EU countries and Australia and Thailand and Uruguay and elsewhere. My organization, because we've done a lot of the detailed modeling of what alternatives to prohibition and those regulatory frameworks for different drugs would look like, when those governments got to that point, the arguments were won domestically or on the international stage, and they got to the point where they're actually ready to move on these things, we often got the call. So we've actually moved from an advocacy position to a consultancy one. So I've been privileged enough to work for the Canadian government and the Mexican government and the Uruguayan government and a whole bunch of governments in Europe now, in Germany and Malta and Netherlands and elsewhere, in dialogue with them, or sometimes in active consultancy with them in designing the policy and legislation. So actually moving from advocacy basically to drafting. And that's been a real privilege to see those arguments progress. And then more recently move beyond cannabis. So we don't just do work on cannabis, we've done work on all drugs.
Where would you say the pushback would be? You said back when you started, people would have said it was fringe. Where is the needle now, and who would be like people that still push back on it, and why would they push back?
I think there's a certain amount of kind of institutional inertia. There's a certain amount of people who have been involved in waging the war on drugs. It's quite a challenging thing. So often people in enforcement or people in border control or customs, people in institutions like the DEA, people who are institutionally and professionally invested in sort of these drug war narratives can find it quite confronting when someone comes along and says the war on drugs has not only not worked, it's actually made things worse. It's actually fueled crime and violence and suffering and death. And it's quite a difficult thing for people who are institutionalized within the war on drugs, the machine that is the war on drugs, to confront that. So they are often a source of resistance. And behind them sits the political resistance, which is that the war on drugs, even if it doesn't work in terms of delivering on public health goals or criminal justice goals or human rights goals or any goals, actually, pretty much it's failed on every metric. Use has been rising, the markets have been expanding, and this is a policy that's specifically supposed to create a drug-free world. It hasn't worked. It absorbs enormous amounts of public finances. But the people who it does work for are certain politicians, because drug war narratives can be enormously powerful. You create fear of drugs, of drug users, of drug dealers, and then you present yourself as the solution to that problem. I will protect you. I will protect your children, your communities, your families. A lot of drug war is very threat-based narratives,
Right.
where it's a threat to the very fabric of society. And it's often been deeply interwoven, as I'm sure that you'll be aware, with quite racially charged narratives around immigration and foreigners coming with their foreign drugs and bringing their drugs, and look, they're all murderers and drug dealers and rapists, and we need to secure our borders. And there's a really uncomfortable overlap between drug war narratives and some xenophobic, border control-y, build a wall type narratives. Interestingly, it's never really been particularly a partisan issue. So you get supporters on the right and left, and in Republicans and Democrats, and this is true across different countries of the world, and you get difference of opinion within every political constituency. So you get some Republicans, for example, who are more libertarian, free market oriented, who are very in favor of legalizing drugs, cannabis and other drugs. But you get other ones who are more sort of socially conservative Republicans who are very much opposed. And so there are these interesting internal debates unfolding even within each different political party.
Interesting.
It's one of the things I quite like about drug policy is that it hasn't become one of those culture war partisan issues until relatively recently, perhaps arguably with some of the fentanyl harm reduction stuff, but we don't have to go into that, although we can if you
Right.
like.
Well, I think it's interesting because the FDA just rejected the use of MDMA for clinical trials for PTSD. So it's a hot topic here in the United States. Some people think we have to go decriminalization. Many states have already made moves to change their policy. Oregon, Colorado, Massachusetts has some bills right now. And it's interesting because I know this sits in a wider legalization context. There's that word, the psychedelic exceptionalism. And I've been really looking at that myself, like, do I fall in that category thinking that, well, these drugs should be decriminalized, certain earth medicines should be decriminalized. And in the United States, we have a lot of science and research on the use of these medicines for symptoms to heal some of the Western ailments of depression and anxiety. But you're talking about a larger context and then a context within the psychedelic movement. So let's start with the psychedelic movement and your book, How to Regulate Psychedelics, this practical guide. Why the need now for this book? Is it all the attention on psychedelics and the new research?
Yeah, it is. And the book is free online, by the way. You don't have to, you can buy a hard copy, but you really don't have to. So if you're interested in it, please go and read it. I'm not doing a kind of Oprah Winfrey style selling my book tour type thing. Please just go and read it. In fact, all of our books, we've written other books on regulating other drugs, and they're all available free on our website. Yeah, we kind of felt that the psychedelic renaissance, as it's become popularly known, was getting a lot of attention. Netflix series, a seemingly endless stream of gushing Sunday supplement feature pieces in like The Atlantic and The New Yorker. And that speaks to a lot of really genuinely fascinating medical research which is going on. And it's really, really exciting. And it's not to belittle that. But our thinking was that if you look at psychedelic use as a whole, the proportion of it that operates within the kind of medical research clinical space is less than 1%. But that 1% is hogging like 99% of the media attention. And then
Exactly.
there's this other 99% of psychedelic use that really isn't getting any attention at all in the media. And it certainly isn't getting any attention in the political sphere and in terms of policy debates. It's complicated what people's motivations are, but a lot of it is taking place in social settings. Most psychedelic use is people going to clubs and parties and festivals or doing their own thing in the park or in the forest or climbing up a mountain or something. It's not formal medical clinical stuff at all. Some of it may be personal exploration or consciousness expansion or spiritual practice or informal therapeutic stuff. But most of it actually is people, I don't want to sound flippant, but having a laugh or,
Right.
sensory enhancement. It's
Right.
pleasure seeking
In
because
some ways,
psychedelics
psychedelic
can be,
renaissance has forgotten that.
psychedelics can be very pleasurable. It can enhance a lot of sensory stuff if you're listening to music. I'm slightly embarrassed to say this. I went to a Grateful Dead tribute band last week.
Yeah.
Right? And it was almost like, I don't even know how to describe it, but there was loads of people literally in tie-dye tops with long hair and headbands,
Mhm.
doing this sort of ecstatic dancing. And it must have been like more than half the people there were clearly tripping, and they were very open about it. That is where most of the psychedelics in the world are being consumed.
Right.
At, you know,
What's
Grateful Dead
fascinating.
tribute act in Alexandra Palace in London, etc., etc., etc. But no
Right.
one's talking about that. I'm not saying that medical stuff doesn't deserve the attention it's getting. It does. But we need to be really
Right.
careful about deserving and undeserving drug users, because if you hold up one group, you see, even within there's psychedelic exceptionalism, even within
Mhm.
psychedelics, because if you hold up
Mm.
one use or motivation or set of outcomes above everyone else, you're in danger of stigmatizing some
Mhm.
people as somehow less worthy of our care and support. And people who use psychedelics in social settings, they do need some policy frameworks and some interventions around that to ensure that they stay safe and that they can make informed decisions and that they receive the care and support that they need and deserve, because we all have a right to health. The right to health is inalienable. It just felt to us like that bit of psychedelic use was not getting any policy attention at all. So we've written a book about what the policy response should be for that lot of psychedelic use, which is most psychedelic use, but it's receiving a paltry amount of attention within the bigger
Right.
psychedelic scene and certainly within drug policy more broadly.
I think that's really interesting. And I can think of my own process in this space of coming in more from the therapeutic model and then realizing, it's so interesting. We're using these medicines to heal these things. And yet, what's more healing than laughter, play, connection? So, what about someone that would say, well, it's already happening, right? People are already using it for raves or social or in the forest and in the woods. Has it been safe to do so?
Well, I went to a talk with Paul Stamets and I asked a similar question. I said, what about psychedelic use in social settings? What do you think? He said, well, psychedelics, they're sacred medicines and they're not recreational drugs. I've got a great deal of respect for Paul, but it seemed like an odd answer because it's like they may not be for you, but for loads of people, for millions of people, they are recreational drugs. Now, we may not like that if we're in the psychedelic spiritual scene or the psychedelic therapeutic scene. We may even find it offensive that people are misusing these sacred medicines or whatever we want to refer to them as. But for a lot of young people in particular, psychedelics are just part of the menu of recreational drugs that they will be considering when they head out at the weekend. Whether we like it or not, that is the reality that we meet as policymakers and have to respond to. We have a responsibility to deal with the world as we find it, not just as the way we might wish it to be. So that's where we've directed our attention. I hope that the book can help people think about how we can do that in a responsible way, and that actually the medical and the non-medical psychedelic use and everything in between, because I think there is a lot of blurry grey area between these different motivations, whether it's spiritual wellness stuff, whether it's more specific clinical therapeutic stuff, or whether it's just pure hedonistic pleasure seeking and sensory enhancement. They all blur together. You can enjoy a spiritual experience. You can get spiritual benefits in a nightclub when you're off your chops on LSD and so on.
Right.
So I think we need to be a bit careful about putting things in boxes when they're all clearly, if you did a Venn diagram, it wouldn't be
Overlapping.
clean lines. It would be lots of blurry stuff. Everybody in the psychedelic scene should be thinking about the broader psychedelic scene and the wider drug law reform movement, which maybe we can come on to in a minute. But I'm happy to talk about what we proposed as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear what you've proposed.
We focused on what we saw as like the four classic psychedelics. So LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. But mostly it's probably going to be psilocybin and LSD. I mean, in terms of, if you look at prevalence of use, they are 98% of all psychedelics use, and actually mescaline and DMT in their various forms, whether that's in a synthetic form or an extracted form or in a plant-based form or whatever, are actually a small minority of all of those psychedelic use. We didn't include MDMA because there's this big debate about whether it's a psychedelic or not. I prefer to think of it as more of an empathogen stimulant. We did write a book, How to Regulate Stimulants, a practical guide. You'll notice there's a running theme here, how to regulate insert drug, a practical guide.
So why don't we start with your definition of psychedelic then?
Oh, God.
Versus empathogen.
Generally, I would define them by their subjective effects and mode of action in terms of brain receptors. But
okay.
It seemed that those four, they cluster together in terms of their similarity of their effects and risk profiles.
Okay.
Now, obviously, we can get into psychedelic risks, and I think it's an important thing to talk about. But I felt like ecstasy, MDMA sits somewhat apart in terms of its effect profile. Yes, there may be some psychedelic effects, but I don't think it produces synesthesia or classic hallucinations or visual distortions, really. I don't think so. Ketamine, nitrous oxide, they're dissociatives. So again, there are some similarities. Ibogaine, maybe that's one of the classic psychedelics, but the effects of ibogaine was sufficiently different and the risk profile was sufficiently different from the four classics. Probably we should just focus on them. But hopefully there are lessons from the book that could be more widely drawn. And there's a whole bunch of synthetic psychedelics as well. We've tried to account for why we've done that in the book and say, look, if the lessons in this or the suggestions are useful elsewhere, great. MDMA is in this book. And it's mostly written about, again, a social settings scenario. And there isn't a
Okay.
plant-based MDMA product. So again, how you would approach it is somewhat different to something like magic mushrooms
So
or
take me
ayahuasca or something.
through your ideas. So there's 4 medicines basically and 4 different approaches.
Yes, but it's not different approaches for the 4 different ones. We suggest broadly that these approaches would apply to all 4. The 4 key models are a decriminalization model, so private use, foraging, and non-profit sharing. A non-profit membership-based association, a kind of social club, cannabis social club type model, a regulated retail model, and then a regulated, supervised or guided experience model. So those are the 4 broad ones, and I could talk a little bit more about each one. Decriminalization of personal possession use, I think, is a baseline for all drug law reform. I just think we need to get beyond this idea that consenting adults should be criminalized in any way for decisions they make about their body and their mind. Criminalizing drug use has no real parallel in other aspects of law. You know, you can do dangerous sports, you can have unsafe sex, you can eat unhealthily, you can rock climb without ropes, you can kill yourself, you know, you can drink yourself to death, you can smoke 50 cigarettes a day.
Would law officials say, and I don't know the answer to this, that a large majority of crimes that are happening, someone is under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, a drug?
Yep.
Would you say that's true?
It certainly can be true. You're not legalizing driving under the influence. You're not legalizing murder whilst you're drunk. If you do something whilst intoxicated, that's not legal as well. The law can cater for antisocial behavior under the influence. You quite often hear this, like, do you want airline pilots driving whilst tripping and flying a plane? No, obviously not. If they did that, they lose their job and go to prison because that's ridiculous.
Right.
No one's advocating that. It's purely the bodily autonomy, and the ultimate zone of autonomy is the mind, and the state has no right to intrude on that. And I'm not like a free market libertarian, but certainly in terms of personal conduct, I suppose I am a libertarian in that I don't feel the state should intervene. If I'm not harming other people, I don't think the state should intervene. And actually, if you look at law generally, if you look at the kind of John Stuart Mill kind of classic thinking on law, the state doesn't intervene unless you're harming other people. And that's up to and including suicide. Now, self-harm, it may be foolish, it may be unwise, it's entirely legitimate for the state to discourage dangerous behaviors or unhealthy behaviors, and including drug use in many cases. But to criminalize people for that is just crossing a line. You know, I can stick a fork in my eye. It's completely stupid. I would discourage people from doing that. So any of your viewers,
Right.
don't do that. Yeah, I don't think you should be criminalized for it. I just think you're a moron, but that's not illegal. Being stupid isn't illegal, which is thankfully, otherwise most of the people around us would be in prison.
So this private use, home cultivation, foraging, and not-for-profit sharing. You're saying
Yes.
that's the baseline for
Yeah, I don't think that the government should or really can intervene with that. Magic mushrooms, I don't know what it's like in the US, but they grow all over the UK.
yeah, all over the
Practically
world. They're
every
ubiquitous.
rugby field, every windswept moor that you've seen in all those movies,
Right.
every they're
Every
covered in magic
farm.
mushrooms
Yeah.
right now. Like we're in mushroom season. It started like about a week ago. Absolutely coated in magic mushrooms. So what can you do? You can't criminalize the land. You can't criminalize plants. You can't criminalize these things. They're part of nature. Our law in the UK is so stupid because the magic mushrooms grow all over the Queen's estate as well, of course, and the Ministry of Defence land, and it grows everywhere. The gardens of Buckingham Palace have probably got magic mushrooms growing. So you can't criminalise them being there or someone having land with magic mushrooms growing on it. Otherwise, everyone again would be in prison.
Now, what about a decriminalization model for, and is this too narrow for plants, like all earth medicines, decriminalization?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any plant should be criminalized. If you extract some poison from a plant and give it to someone, that is a crime. The plant itself shouldn't be criminalized. You know,
Right.
if you do something stupid with it, it's like a kitchen knife. You know, you should be allowed to chop up potatoes. If you stab someone
Right.
with it, we frown on that.
So this
Um,
particular model that you think is the baseline, how well received is this? Are we closer to seeing at a federal level, these changes?
I mean, I think decriminalization of drug possession more broadly, and this does bring in the wider issues. And
Right.
I don't know how much we want to get into this. I could talk about it a lot, but decriminalization of drugs more broadly, I feel like we are moving towards it for some of the reasons I've been rabbiting on about. It's just inappropriate to be criminalizing people for possession of drugs for personal use. It's no longer a minority position. This is advocated by all agencies of the UN. There is a common position statement by all of the agencies of the UN, including the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, including the World Health Organization, including the UN human rights entities. They've all put their name to a statement that says we shouldn't be criminalizing people for using drugs. It's counterproductive, it's expensive, the burden is carried disproportionately by marginalized populations. It hasn't worked in deterring use, and it increases drug-related risks. It's just a stupid thing to do. At its core, it's fundamentally unethical. So I think governments generally are moving towards a decrim position. You've seen that in the US. So I know there's been controversy in Oregon, but even in the US.
Because Oregon went with a broader decriminalization model
Mhm.
and is rolling it back a little bit.
Unfortunately, what happened in Oregon was a combination of things, but it fell into this sort of politicized sort of culture war partisan vortex where the decriminalization move came at an unfortunate moment just before COVID, just as the housing crisis was getting worse and the fentanyl crisis was really blowing up. In some ways, it was a mitigation against some of those things, particularly some of the drug-related overdose deaths. But the policy was implemented, and the idea was that they would redirect a certain amount of, I think, cannabis taxes into treatment programs. And it was a year old after it had been implemented. The money hadn't arrived for the treatment programs because of a sort of slightly stilted rollout process and getting the money through. Certainly hadn't been spent on any treatment programs. So after a year, everyone was going, well, hang on, look, there's more homeless people and overdose deaths are going up. This isn't working. We better reverse it. It became an opportunity for different groupings within the US, in Oregon's case, particularly Republicans, to have a go at Democrats as being soft on drugs or being, pro harm reduction enablers. Look, you brought in this policy, drug deaths have gone up. That's your fault. It became incredibly simplistic, and actually, there was a lot more complicated things going on around the housing crisis, the fentanyl crisis, the fact that the systems that it was designed to put in place hadn't put in place yet, so hadn't had a chance to have their impact. It all got rather messy, and now, unfortunately, it's being rolled back. But rolling it back is not going to help. The problems are still going to keep getting worse there until they move away from a punitive approach to a public health approach. We know, generally speaking, if you start punishing drug users, criminalizing them, putting them in jail, using policing and enforcement and punishment as your frontline position, you're not going to get good outcomes. It's expensive. It doesn't work. It generally harms the most vulnerable people. It makes dangerous drugs even more dangerous. And it siphons money away from services, health services that we know work, and puts it into punitive measures that we know don't work and are actively harmful. It's a shame what's happening in Oregon, and hopefully that won't prevent any progress anywhere else. Because other countries have been doing decriminalization and had very good outcomes. If you go and look at Portugal, for example, Portugal's probably the most high-profile example, but they decriminalized possession of drugs in 2001 in a similar way to what was happening in Oregon. And Oregon was significantly modeled on what was done in Portugal. And the outcomes have been great. They've had a massive drop in drug-related deaths, a massive drop in HIV transmission amongst people who inject drugs. They've seen the prison population fall. The outcomes have been all good. If you dig around, you can find some negative outcomes, obviously, because there's a lot of data there. Because one of the things they did was they collected really good data, so we can actually see a lot of these positive outcomes. But basically, they just moved to a health approach. They said, look, people with drug problems, this is a health issue. Let's deal with it as a health issue using health institutions rather than a sort of more politically motivated posturing, a drug war grandstanding that we're going to punish people for use drugs and that will stop them. And actually, problematic drug use has gone down in Portugal as well. A lot of people who are using problematic drugs, I'm talking about injecting heroin and smoking crack and, much more at the problematic end, they're often dealing as well to support their own use. And if you can get those people into treatment, get them the support they need, stabilize their lives, they're much more likely to get off drugs. And if they're not using drugs, they're not going to be selling them or trying to recruit new users either. So you've actually seen a decrease in new users of heroin and a decrease in overdose deaths at the same time it's been spiking and going through the roof in the US. I think there's a lesson there. And it's not just Portugal. I mean, there's about 45 countries around the world
Right.
have decriminalized either cannabis or all drugs. Spain and Italy and Austria, a number of European countries have done similar to what Portugal has done, but they're not so celebrated and they're not so ruthlessly interrogated. But, other
Right.
countries as well, parts of Latin America, personal possession of drugs is not illegal in Colombia under certain quantity thresholds. Again, I'm not encouraging people to go to Colombia and use drugs, and you have to be careful and look at the laws of the land in any individual place. But it's not unique to Portugal. It's a very well-established policy paradigm. It's not an end in itself. It's an enabler of a public health approach. You say, look, drug use, particularly problematic drug use, we need to address this with health institutions, not criminal justice ones. It's that simple, really. And it's
Yeah.
endorsed by numerous medical associations and medical authorities, including and up to the World Health Organization.
So, how do you begin to roll something like that out in the United States, where it is
Well,
more health oriented versus criminalization?
I mean, I think we've begun to see some of that. I can't remember where it came from, but there's a sort of old saying that crisis precipitates change or enables radical change. And the fentanyl crisis obviously has been so acute and awful and traumatic and tragic for so many people in America. Fentanyl is responsible for 70, 80,000 deaths a year now in the US, just terrifying levels of overdose deaths, particularly in combination with other drugs, which the deaths increasing. So you now have over 100,000 deaths, overdose deaths a year. And that's a tenfold increase on 15 years ago. So you look at the graph, it's absolutely terrifying. But the crisis has got so bad that I think it's forced people in the US to look at what they were doing and rethink the war on drugs. And what has happened is that the US, at a federal level and at numerous state levels, has pivoted towards a health and harm reduction approach. So we're seeing the distribution of naloxone, the distribution of clean needles, the provision of safer consumption spaces. Because before you get someone into treatment and recovery and rehabilitation, they have to be alive. You can't get into recovery if you're dead. So the first thing we have to do is to keep people alive. And to do that, you need frontline, low threshold harm reduction. And the US federal government has moved to support that at last. It's very much in the federal drug strategy. They advocate for it on the international stage and at the UN. Blinken came to the UN for the first time ever, to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs this year. First time the Secretary of State's ever showed up at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and gave a passionate speech in favor of harm reduction. There is still the war on drugs, the enforcement side of things, where we're going to prevent fentanyl coming in from, all these horrible foreigners bringing their fentanyl over from Mexico or from China or whoever your xenophobic target of the day is. But that stuff doesn't work. In fact, the drug enforcement stuff in many ways has incentivized the move towards fentanyl. Because if you're a drug dealer, why would you bring in 50 kilos of heroin when you can bring in 1 kilo of fentanyl and sell it for the same amount of money? Because it's 50 times stronger than heroin. In fact, why don't you bring in carfentanil, which is 1,000 times stronger than heroin? And then you could bring the matchbox of that instead of 50 kilos of it. One of the things that drug enforcement does is actually it creates these perverse economic incentives that tilt the market towards ever more dangerous products, more potent, dangerous, deadly products like fentanyl. Fentanyl is a creature of the war on drugs. The war on drugs created that market. More war on drugs is not gonna solve it. And here we are. We're supposed to be talking about psychedelics, Michaela.
Okay, well, let's go back to psychedelics.
Right, back
So we have
to psychedelics. So, I mean, one of the things about psychedelics, when we came to psychedelics, and this is interesting, it does relate to the fentanyl thing, is that when you apply regulatory theory to psychedelics, regulation is all about managing and minimizing risk. And the more risky a particular drug or behavior is, the more regulation, I think the more state intervention is justified. So it's much easier to justify state intervention with people injecting fentanyl, where there's an extremely high risk of death, versus some people taking some magic mushrooms in a park, where the risk of death is effectively zero unless you do something really stupid under the influence. The generally low risk profile of psychedelics, at least relative to other groups of drugs, like sedatives and opioids, or like stimulants and cocaine and amphetamines and so on, means that you don't really need the same level of state intervention. I don't think, that you don't need such intrusive regulation because they're just not as risky. They're not associated with overdose deaths. They're not associated with addiction. You can't really become addicted to psychedelics. It's quite difficult to take so many that you actually die. The main risk is either behavior under the influence is one set of risks, and then there are certain mental health vulnerabilities. There are certain people or
Right.
certain contraindications with certain SSRIs, for example, where people shouldn't be taking psychedelics if you have certain histories of mental illness and stuff. Some people may say, well, psychedelics can help heal that. Well, that's as may be, but I think people with psychotic illnesses, for example, schizophrenia, probably shouldn't be taking large doses of LSD and going to a Grateful Dead tribute band.
Someone is in the underground in the United States. They serve medicine underground, one-on-one, whatever, 1-on-5. Would the decrim model support that work?
Potentially. The point at which I think that the decrim model moves to one where some government intervention is necessitated is when it becomes transactional or when it becomes commercialized. So I think if you forage some mushrooms and you share them amongst your friends, whether that's for fun, whether it's for spiritual reasons or some kind of informal therapeutic reasons, whether you call it a drug or a medicine or a sacred plant, whatever your cultural context for that is, if you're starting to commercialize it or there's a financial transaction going on, I think that needs to be regulated. It's pretty much impossible to regulate anyway. I mean, if you literally grow some mushrooms in your attic or you pick them in your garden and you share them with friends, at what point can the government intervene anyway? Because they won't even know about it. They're not going to kick down your doors and go, hello, got some mushrooms, have you? No, that's just not going to happen. For me, it's when it becomes transactional. So just to whiz through the models. So one model is the social club model, which is a retail model and it is regulated, but it's a non-profit model. It's membership based, and the people who run the association or club will grow magic mushrooms predominantly, possibly other psychedelic plants, but mostly magic mushrooms, and will supply them to members.
How do you feed LSD into that model?
LSD is a bit trickier because it's not plant-based. It may be quasi-plant-based if people say, well, it's made from ergot. It is a plant-based drug. Well, no, it's not really. To all intents and purposes, it's a synthetic drug. Although, interestingly, you can make synthetic versions of mescaline, DMT, and psilocybin as well. Now, some people may say, well,
does
it's
that
different
fit
if you do
into
it
the
that
model
way.
that certain chemists would be making these within a club?
The club model, as we've envisaged it, is for plant-based drugs only at this stage. Maybe at some point in the future, there could be some sort of provision of synthetics, including LSD. But I think one of the benefits of plant-based drugs is they're intrinsically self-limiting. It's harder to take too much if you have to physically consume a plant-based product.
Okay.
Whether
So let's take a medicine like ayahuasca. Is that going to fit in the first two models?
Probably not. I think ayahuasca most sensibly fits within a regulated, guided experience or sort of retreat type model where you have a licensed provider. There are codes of conduct around issues of safeguarding and accountability, and they have to have achieved certain training. The products that they serve would be quality controlled in some appropriate way. It would be a licensed service, and I think that's appropriate because I think there are different risks when you have a guided experience to just selling something in a shop, because I think people are under the influence of psychedelics can be very vulnerable, and I think you do need some safeguards there. A licensing process for those sorts of services is appropriate, and the detail about how you would do that, we go into that a bit in the book, but I think that needs to be worked out on a sort of case-by-case basis in different cultures and so on.
You have door number 1, decrim.
Yeah. Door number 2 is the
You have
social
door number
clubs.
2.
And then I've sort of jumped straight to 4 now. But door number 2 is the non-profit membership-based associations. Number 3 is regulated retail. So that would be more like the cannabis shops that you see in some 22 or 24 US states. Not like liquor stores. I mean, I think they need to be a bit more regulated than liquor stores. I think people who are selling psychedelic products, the vendors should be trained. So almost a bit more like over-the-counter sales of drugs in a pharmacy. not like a pharmacy, but in as far as the vendor is both responsible for a code of conduct. You have to do, there'll be age access controls. You're selling for personal use. You can't sell 5,000 grams of mushrooms. You could sell a personal use dose. You have to be over 18 or over 21 or whatever the jurisdiction. So there are rules that would need to be abided by. But also, crucially, the vendor is trained to give advice on safer use, on toxicity, on effects, on harm reduction. Don't take a powerful trip near open water or near cliffs, right, or don't do it on the top of a building. And basic stuff about set and setting. Don't do this if you're not in a good state of mind. Don't do this if you have certain mental health problems. Don't do this X, Y, Z. All the solid, basic harm reduction, safety, safeguarding information can be imparted at point of sale if you have a trained vendor within a licensed context. The products themselves obviously would have to be regulated as well in terms of accurate labeling, accurate dosage, health information, risk warnings, all that stuff would have to be on the packaging as well.
Now, how do we make sure that doesn't go toward a more commercial capitalist capture model?
I think if you look at prescribed pharmaceuticals, the US is unusual in this respect, but in most countries in the world, pharmaceuticals are not allowed to advertise to patients. I mean, they are in the US, which is weird. You should change that. Yep. They're not allowed to be branded or marketed actually in any way at all. And you can look at the picture. We've mocked up the packaging in the book.
Yes, very bland,
they would be basically
plain,
bland pharmaceutical style packaging. Now, some people in the psychedelic scene have sort of said, oh, that's so miserable. That would give me a bad trip if I saw that big pharma stuff. And I'm like, well, it's purely functional. It's right. What's in the package. It's health information, warnings, dosage, a QR code that will take you to a website. It's just functional. And if you did put like Paisley unicorns or some Mandelbrot set or something on there, it would influence people's experience in another way. We just were like, no, let's just cut our losses. Let's just keep it as functional, plain pharmaceutical packaging. It is almost a pharmacy style model. It doesn't have to physically feel like a pharmacy, but the products would be regulated like pharmaceutical products. They are effectively medicines and should be regulated in a similar way. You don't want people making false claims, or unevidenced medical claims. This will heal this or that.
Right.
In the same way that herbal supplements, you can't sell herbal supplements, say this will cure cancer, because that is illegal. Even in the US, right. It's illegal. You try and use the products and the point of sale as an opportunity to get information to your target group, which is the people using them, on right. Dosage, risk, safer use, harm reduction, and that, don't drive, don't do this if you've got certain mental health, all of that stuff. Don't mix with other drugs. Basic drug harm reduction of the kind that you would get at festivals, that you would get on leaflets at nightclubs.
Right.
Because that is going to significantly be your audience. Now, you may not like that, but that's what it is. And we have to deal with that. That's where we have to go. So if those people are doing those drugs in those settings, the information has to be tailored for them. Whether it's someone laughing their ass off in a park or dancing their ass off in a nightclub or right. at a Grateful Dead tribute wearing a tie-dye right. top and headband and long hair and what have you. That's the world we live in, and that's the world we have to deal with.
Is anybody currently globally doing that model yet?
Not really. I mean, you have these kind of quasi-legal models that are emerging. So in the Netherlands, you can buy philosopher's stone. Do you know what I'm talking about? They're the kind of underground bits of magic mushrooms. They're like called truffles sometimes.
Yes.
There was basically unregulated open sales of magic mushrooms in the Netherlands. And some tourists were going and getting absolutely wasted on these mushrooms. And they were stoned and drunk. And, let's do some mushrooms. And then they'd fall in a canal or something or do something idiotic. So the government, right, let's ban them. Classic kind of knee-jerk reaction to a few shock tabloid stories. So they banned the sale of magic mushrooms, but weirdly, they didn't ban the sale of the truffles, even though they are, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same thing. I'm sure some psychedelic nerds will argue with me about that, but they contain psilocybin. They're basically the same thing. So you can still, in the Netherlands, go into any one of hundreds of different maybe not hundreds, there's a bunch of different smart shops in Amsterdam or anywhere around the country. And they have some health warnings on the packaging, saying, this is the effect, this is the dose, don't have too much, don't drive, don't use if you're under 18, da, 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 da. They won't sell them to under 18s. So they're kind of quasi-formally regulated and nothing bad's happened. There is no noticeable public health burden or footprint of any kind related to that. And there may well be benefits. If people are using relatively low dose psilocybin, I'm not talking about full cosmic experience, sort of 3 or 4 dry grams type trip, a sort of low dose, half a gram, 1 gram type trip. And as a result, they're not drinking 10 beers and doing loads of coke and pills and ketamine and Christ knows what else, then it may actually be quite good harm reduction in social settings, because it's relatively safe. So, if people are using magic mushrooms, low dose magic mushrooms, instead of taking loads of other much more dangerous drugs, it's probably a net public health positive. So nothing really bad's happened there. There's a few other places where magic mushrooms have never been criminalized, like Jamaica. Magic mushrooms are not criminalized in Jamaica. You can grow them, take them, sell them. Some people do, most people don't. The idea that if you legalize magic mushrooms, suddenly you would create some kind of mushroom zombie apocalypse or something. Places where they've been legal, that just really hasn't happened. And there's various other places where they're effectively decriminalized. And
so is this where you think in some ways drug, I don't know if it's exceptionalism, but where people would say, okay, I'm comfortable with that because you're never going to get addicted to psilocybin. It might have some positive benefits if it's showing in all this research. Even as you said, you go out into a park. I have interviewed people that have gone to festivals and it's literally changed their lives, their trajectory of their life because of the experience they had. It gets complicated though, because then it's like, well, I like a little psilocybin with a little MDMA. Is that going to be allowed in this door number 3 approach of this partially pharmaceutical model? Or is it just going to be country by country, state by state?
The sequencing of it will vary on an ad hoc basis from one jurisdiction to the next. There will be political drivers, there will be cultural drivers, there will be some advocacy group will get a bunch of money. If you look at the way the cannabis reforms have spread across different states in the US, it's an interesting example. First it was Colorado and Washington, and then basically there's been this cascade of other states. But the process and the policies that have emerged has actually been quite different in different states. So some of them are very commercialized. Some of them are much more strictly regulated. Vermont has effectively a decrim give and grow model where you can't sell it, but you can grow it and share it amongst your friends. So it's a bit like the decrim model I was talking about for magic mushrooms. Obviously, people are then trying to game it where they sort of say, buy this $40 cup of coffee and we'll give you a free bag of weed. So there's always some grifters trying to game it. But the thing with other drugs is we need to legalize and regulate drugs that are conspicuously more dangerous than magic mushrooms and cannabis as well, for the simple pragmatic reason that loads of people are using them, whether we like it or not. So we have to legalize and regulate pragmatically. We have to legalize and regulate all drugs, including the ones that we don't like, or the ones that we're scared of, or the ones that are definitely really bad for you, the ones that are addictive, the ones that you can overdose and die on. Cocaine, like I have no love for cocaine at all. People who are using it I find quite boring and tedious and self-absorbed and egotistical. I would rather they didn't. I would rather they use something else or didn't use anything. But hundreds of millions of people use cocaine, and that, again, pragmatically, that is your starting point. You either regulate that market as responsibly as you can, the entire supply chain from production in Colombia or wherever it is, through to ration sales of pharmaceutical style products with health warnings on in pharmacy type retail outlets, or you leave it with Pablo Escobar and the cartels. Those are your two choices. It's Netflix Narcos, or it's boring pharmaceutical products sold in boring shops. I'm all about taking the drama out of it. No one's going to make a Netflix series about a boring shop selling a boring product. It's an anti-drama policy, basically. And we've written a book, the stimulants book. It's got MDMA in it, and it's free online. You don't have to buy it. It's also got how to regulate cocaine in there. And it's really difficult. It's much harder to regulate cocaine than cannabis, because cocaine is really bad for you. It's bad for your heart. It's really addictive. You can take too much and die. You become codependent with alcohol. It can make you into a total dick. People who smoke it or inject it, it's even more problematic. But that's the world we live in, and you
Right.
regulate it and approach it as a public health challenge, or you carry on doing the same shit we've been doing for all of these decades that's demonstrably not reduced cocaine use, because cocaine use is going up, cocaine markets are expanding. It's empowered Pablo Escobar and all the cartels and organized crime groups across the world. And it's causing bloodshed and mayhem and chaos from the streets of US cities all the way to the jungles of the Amazon and beyond. So it's like there's no third option in which that market disappears. It's basically government or
Right.
gangsters. There's no third option that it magically disappears, whatever you might wish. So, yes, we do need to legalize cocaine as well, and all the drugs that are really bad for you that you don't like, because people use them. And that is the reality. Prohibition has not stopped that. We either
Mm-mm.
regulate them or you leave them with the cartels. And those are your two choices. The regulated guided experience or supervised use model, I think there are different elements to that, but it's about safeguarding, vetting, licensed users, probably licensed physical premises as well, to make sure that they're safe and appropriate environment, guidance and oversight of the actual products themselves to make sure that things like potency and dosage are being controlled, training for people if someone has an adverse experience, appropriate vetting to make sure that people aren't inappropriately brought into an experience that they're not ready for or that would put them at undue risk. Things like age controls, vetting for certain mental health problems, contraindications with certain medications, that kind of thing. Some people have said, how would sort of traditional shamanic
Yeah, I was just about to
practitioners
ask this. Yes.
from indigenous communities, could they be incorporated into that? We think that they could, but there would have to be there would have to be a regulatory framework around that. So they could become licensed, they could take the training and licensing themselves. To be honest, this model, it's based on traditional shamanic practice anyway. I mean, I think we can learn a lot from millennia of evolution of those of shamanic practices. They don't have a harm reduction policy. Harm
Right.
reduction is just obviously part of it because that's what you would do, because they're thoughtful people. Careful preparation, supervised use, integration
Equitable
after
access,
integration afterwards.
integration.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
all of those things have their roots in traditional ceremonial and shamanic practices to some extent. Because shaman is not a protected term, and different indigenous cultures have different conceptions of spirit guides and shaman and so on. So you can't generalize about that. There isn't sort of like, I'm a shaman, I'm a qualified shaman. It's a bit of a nonsensical concept. I think you can
Right.
have traditional practices within a wider licensed psychedelic practice. So you could
So
have, for
where would like
example,
a psychedelic church, in the United States, there's a lot of people that get classified as a psychedelic church. Where does that fit in that model?
we do touch on this in the book, which obviously you know because you read it, every single word. It can get a bit tricky because there are specific laws around freedom of belief and practice and specific laws around non-interference with religions. That can get a bit messy, like what qualifies as traditional practices, what qualifies as a religion, what are the boundaries of those protections. Santa Diem churches, for example, young people and children often participate. Some people would be very uncomfortable with that. It doesn't seem to be that big a problem. But should the state intervene there? Or, should the state be monitoring dosage in what's being served? Or should they ensure there are certain safety guidelines and practices? It gets a bit tricky with the religious stuff. I do think that traditional religious practice needs to be protected. The UN Charter on Indigenous Rights is very clear on that we don't have the rights to interfere with people's belief and practice, and that includes use of traditional medicines and psychedelic plants. The worry I have is that you then get grifters trying to exploit these laws around religious freedoms to set up churches and basically they're just trying to sell stuff or do some nefarious activity. And I have a concern about people exploiting some of those rules and laws around religions to basically open a shop selling whatever it
Yeah.
is that they want to
It is
sell.
complicated though, because for people that believe that DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, ibogaine, ayahuasca provide for a mystical experience or expansion of consciousness, Yeah, it is complicated because why should the government be involved? And in some ways, if you're not indigenous, but you still have found religious or spiritual expansion again of your being.
Terms like indigenous and religion are often quite difficult to pin down legally anyway. We're beginning to see this in the US situations where people are setting up churches to give out some drug or other. I don't think all of them are legit. It's the curse of regulation, is that if you have one bad actor, that creates a regulatory burden for everybody.
What would you say to someone that says, don't call them drugs?
I'd say I'm not particularly interested in that. They are psychoactive substances, if you prefer. I generally use drugs as a catch-all for physical substances that affect your state of consciousness, that are psychoactive in some way. If someone wants to regard them as a sacrament or a medicine, that's fine. They're
Right.
obviously free to do that. But from a legal and policy perspective, they are psychoactive drugs or psychoactive substances.
Okay, so I had thrown out a reclassification model, and I think you said that that would take years. True?
This is the reclassification, a bit like they're trying to reclassify cannabis.
Yeah, reclassify ibogaine, iboga, which have been traditional sacred medicines. Some would say psilocybin, even 5-MeO-DMT. What about a model like that where we're reclassifying earth medicines across the board?
I would incorporate that within a wider decriminalization model. I wouldn't separate earth medicines, as you call them. If people are taking the same drugs and just laughing their ass off in a park,
Right.
is that an earth medicine? They're not recreational drugs, they're sacred medicines. It's like, well, they are for you, but for the dude in the club, it's a recreational drug. You just need to get your head around that, because that's the world we live in. I would decriminalize all of them, also foraging and home growing and non-profit sharing. And then I would regulate the clubs, I'd regulate the shops, and I'd regulate the guided experiences and retreats and so on appropriately. You can get into the detail of what that regulation means, and you can read the book if people want to dig into it. And if you did that, I think if you've got those four models, and we imagine them running concurrently, I think that caters for pretty much everybody. Your party users, your spiritual journey men, women, the kind of retreat type model, the informal sort of therapeutic stuff. I've been talking to the Colorado regulators who are in the process of formulating their model for regulating natural medicines. And I said, why are you calling them natural medicines? They were like, well, that was what was in the ballot initiative. We probably wouldn't have done that. And I'm like, what's a medicine for someone is a recreational drug for someone else. That also goes for ketamine and heroin and cannabis. And, these cocaine, these drugs all have medical uses and are all we call it the British National Formula. I don't know what the equivalent is in the US, but there's this big fat book of all the drugs and all their medical uses and how they can be prescribed and who sells them and makes them. All those drugs are in there. Not fentanyl is a really useful medical drug. I've had fentanyl as a patient. I've had heroin as a patient in hospital. A friend of mine's an anaesthetist. When I was writing one of my many boring books on drug regulation, he took me into the A&E, opened up the locked cabinet and just showed me all these. He said, look, there you go. Cocaine, heroin, ketamine, fentanyl, methamphetamine. It was all in there. These things all have medical uses. I mean, in the UK, if you ever need an example of how drug risk is context specific, we use a nasal spray for toddlers under 5s called Ayendi, Ayendi. And it's dimorphine. It's a dimorphine nasal spray. That is heroin. We have a heroin nasal spray for toddlers. And it's completely normalized. It's really useful. It's very effective painkiller for toddlers. And there's an under 3s one as well. These drugs are safe if they're used in the right dose, in the right context, in a clinical context. They become very dangerous when they're dirty and sold on the streets and used with shared needles in grubby back alleys. So it's all about context and risk and managing it.
You make so many good points, even calling it the natural health bill. And you had mentioned earlier in the conversation that there's so many psychedelics, 2CB and all these other psychedelics that don't necessarily get included in the current conversation.
It might be a medicine. It's not natural. You can synthesize all of these drugs, DMT, psilocybin. And there's loads of backstreet chemists and pharmaceutical companies who are messing around with those molecules. And there's a bunch of different psilocybin molecules with an extra little atom stuck on somewhere,
Right.
because they can patent it and then they can charge you every time you use it. And you can't do that with magic mushrooms because they're growing everywhere, including the Queen's garden. Oh, sorry, she's dead. The King. God rest her soul.
Yes. Anything else we didn't touch on that you'd like us
Well,
to know?
I suppose there's something. It was a point I've made at a few psychedelics talks in the medical space, which is that I do feel that people in the medical, spiritual, psychedelics world, they need to be part of the wider drug law reform movement.
Yeah,
They
I'm
need to be
seeing that.
thinking about and talking about non-medical use of psychedelics in social settings, because, as I've said, that's most psychedelic use.
Right.
And they also need to be thinking about the wider war on drugs. So, like I've also said, all those drugs that they don't love or that they're afraid of, they're more dangerous drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine and
Mhm.
heroin and all of that other stuff that people are using. If we're serious about healing trauma and using psychedelics to heal trauma, we can't ignore the fact that the war on drugs is fueling
Right.
unbelievable amounts of pain and suffering and trauma and death across the world.